Hi there, and welcome to today's guest lecture on Alpine lake fisheries. I'm Christine Parisek. I'm a PhD researcher in Andrew Ripple's lab, and I study freshwater science, primarily mountain lake landscapes, but my research is pretty broad. So right now I'm exploring patterns and statistical distributions of lake abundance and size across mountain ranges. So for like the Cascades and Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevada, and so forth. But then in the summer, I'm working in the field to also look at Sierra Lakes project and understand lake food web structure in these lakes across the Sierra Nevada. So that means I'm trying to identify like who's eating who and in the food web, and then why the answer to that question might shift based on properties that are inside the lake itself or the environment around it. So today's goal is to introduce you to high elevation mountain lake ecosystems and what makes them unique if you aren't already familiar with them, and to dig into the background of alpine lake fisheries and why it's also such a charged topic that we still grapple with today. We'll cover the challenges in mountain lake management and go through a couple case study examples of how guest species play a role as well in managing these systems. And we'll also discuss options to sustain healthy fisheries and especially in mountain lakes, and since they're probably here to stay. And then briefly, we'll shift gears into how these questions influence some of the work that I do. First, what would a fish class be without some thematic fish art, right? So this one's called Dream Catch. It's fly fishing for golden trout. So it's one of my favorite watercolors of this fish. It's showing our state fish, the golden trout, catching a fly fishing fly. If you can see my mouse, it's right there. And fun fact, the golden trout is actually only native to just a few rivers in Southern California in the Sierra Nevada. So everywhere else, it's actually technically non-native. This is an installment of Fly Fishing Travel poster series, which I thought had a pretty neat perspective on the scene. It's showing an angler fly fishing and 5 different trout species in the foreground in this small Sierra stream, which is actually an unlikely scenario, as we'll get to later today. And of course, a true Sierra Nevada fish, which was constructed from Sierra Nevada bottle caps and epoxy resin. Okay, so lakes globally. There have been several attempts by researchers to estimate this total number of lakes and water bodies on Earth. And estimates from the early 90s had put that total number to about 10 million lakes, while more recent estimates put that number closer to 142 million lakes. That's a big jump. But the resolution and the tools for these types of analyses have improved a great deal since then too. So why do people care so much about this number? Well, because freshwater is so important to people. From the ecological standpoint, lakes are buffering the impact of floods and droughts and are providing aquatic subsidies like food and nutrients to the surrounding area. But also, global lake censuses like this can provide information at a global scale for modeling estimates. So I'm talking big numbers here. So ones that can be used to help with climate change modeling, estimating carbon flux, or understanding hydrological and biogeochemical processes at a macro scale. And we do need to be able to understand and address these questions at the larger scale to make sense of what's going on regionally too. But imagine trying to get at those sorts of big impact questions with a number that might be, say, 100 million lakes off, at least at one point. Yikes. Our estimate actually now is still probably very off because it's not accounting for water bodies that are smaller than this size here, the 0.002 kilometers squared in surface area. But we do know now that the highest concentration in surface area of lakes are at the Arctic and boreal latitudes. So that's up here at 45 to 75 of the Earth's equator. And we also know that lake size is decreasing drastically across elevation. So 85% of lakes are located at lower elevation, which is below 500 meters above sea level. So that's 85% of lakes are just in that small elevation gap. And however, notice that I said that we have 142 million lakes over that certain size. So therein lies one of the important points of these alpine lake systems and their fishes and fisheries that I want to get across today, and that's that mountain lakes are typically much smaller than that value, as you'll see later too. But these global lake databases don't have the means to account for lakes that are so small in these high elevation sites. But small lakes are commonly stocked with fish and need some form of management to support a thriving system. And much of the management that we're applying to these small lakes, and whether it's for fishes or for other reasons as well, it's based on literature that's primarily been done in these larger lakes. And it's like if you're trying to build a table from IKEA using a manual that's on purpose the wrong item, like they don't actually go together, but we don't have something better to help us manage these systems. We're using information from these big systems and trying to apply them to these very different small systems. And it's a challenge. Now, this is a global map showing all the mountain regions in the world. So high mountains are this light turquoise color. Scattered low mountains are this greenish brown color that's over here. And so I really like this map. And the research is actually showing that small lakes in these regions are actually playing a disproportionately important role in the flow of nutrients and processing of materials at all scales. But this is because the lakes can't be seen on satellite image analyses that we're not able to capture them in those kinds of analyses. So we know they're really important, but we're not able to capture them in certain sorts of analyses that we need to be. But it would require ground truthing and backpacking to remote areas to map them one by one to start trying to fix things like this or improve our techniques. Geologically, the Sierra Nevada, that's right here, is primarily made up of granite that's been pushed up over millions of years. It's also here in this map, you see the Sierra Nevada, and it's here connected to the Cascades. So the Southern Sierra is actually the one primarily made up of this granite over here, whereas the Northern Sierras actually have a fair amount of volcanic rock. So that's kind of from around like where the Lassen National Park is and up is a little bit more volcanic material. And actually, you'll find that this northern part of the Sierras are more groundwater fed, whereas the more granite portion in the south are more primarily fed by snowmelt. But 75% of California's water supply comes from the Sierra snowpack. It snows in the winter, hopefully, and then in the spring it begins to melt and it recharges our groundwater supply. And then it melts into headwater streams and makes it all the way into the Central Valley. Or we'll find ways to capture it in our reservoirs. Lakes in the Sierra Nevada are cold water systems that are very sensitive to climate change. And mostly they're driven by snowmelt and ice dynamics, and our understanding of their temperature dynamics are still very poorly understood. And given the difficulty of access to these sites, these lakes have also been very poorly studied at a local scale as well. So now at the regional scale, previously we were talking about the global scale. So at the regional scale, scientists are asking what's happening to these fragile systems and how will the inhabitants of these lakes respond to climate change? And then how will the ecology of these lakes be changing over time, say with warming temperatures, more fire on the landscape, and so forth. So let's look at one such area. So here I've zoomed in on the Lassen National Forest. So first, this is an inset map of, this is all of California. And I'm zooming in on this region here in the Lassen National Forest. And so this big map is that. And I'm pointing to one particular lake, which a photograph of is right here. And here in the map, the purple polygons are representing lake data in this major USA lake database. Pretty easy to get your hands on. And these polygons are overlaid on top of just a picture of a Google map, basically. And so all these gray shapes here on the map are actually lakes in this map photo, which the lake database doesn't have data for. It doesn't know that they're there, basically. So this is a pretty important water body data set with a really good resolution of capturing lakes that are greater than 0.001 kilometers squared. So a little bit better than the database I mentioned previously. But still, if I use this data set for some mountain lake analysis, I'd be missing all of these gray water bodies in that analysis. So a lake, especially like even say Emerald Lake here, they're not actually small that it's insignificant. It's just that they're not detectable by the current census methods. Small Sierra lakes are also not homogeneous. So there are different types. Primarily, it was glaciers that carved U-shaped valleys in the Sierra Nevada range, and they formed lakes like cirque lakes that are bowl-shaped lakes with steep sides that were scooped out by ice, so like glacial erosion. Then you can have paternoster lakes, which are these linked glacial staircases that go and they drop in steps that are usually from cirque lakes and then continue down. And there are also lake basins. So like an area surrounding Lake Tahoe, there's lots of lakes there, or there's an area called the Lakes Basin, which is an hour north of Tahoe, lots of lakes there. Then you can also get kettle lakes, which are pooled in these hollow areas that tend to have moraine. So areas like the California Golden Trout Wilderness has some lakes like this. Still then, you can get these steep Sierra slopes that there were a landslide happened and it ends up damming a stream or altering some drainage and forming a lake in that way too that hadn't previously been there. So Mirror Lake in Yosemite is an example of that one. And then of course, there are these human-made reservoirs that even in the mountains. So here's an example of one of these types. So Big Bear Lake in the Lakes Basin where I did my master's work. I actually resurveyed this last summer for a new project. You can see glacier movement cause these striated rock surfaces here in the image. And this is a series of lakes that might fit the paternoster definition. So you can see there's a lake in the background, and there's a lake a little bit closer in the foreground, and there's actually one or two lakes behind the photographer as well. They're just a little bit higher in elevation. So you can see that might form that from a cirque lake stepping down. These are probably paternoster lakes. And this lake usually contains rainbow trout. On the other hand, Silver Lake experienced greater erosional forces. So this is what we would call a cirque lake, and it has brook trout. A cirque lake is one that the lake was scooped out in its shape. And so it has a surprisingly deep point. So let's say this is the steep rock edge, then you go straight down, then the deep zone is going to be somewhere here. But so relative to its size, it's going to have a surprisingly deep bottom and really steep sides even within the lake. And so cirque lakes tend to be up in the headwaters, really high up on top of a mountain, for example, and have those deeper sides. So the Sierra Nevada has 24 native and 11 endemic fish species. But over 6,000, of an elevation over 6,000 feet, the lakes are historically fishless, but now there are fish. So I have a question, and I'll give you a moment to think about it. If I gave you a mission to stock a couple hundred trout in a lake right at the top of that mountain, right here, how would you do it? Well, here's a demo of one way. So people are achieving this by airlifting fish from hatcheries, flying them to remote lakes, and dropping them from a plane into the lakes. The fish are kept in icy cold water. They're probably not flying first class though, and they're always juveniles when they're stocked. So they're just a couple of inches long, and their small size actually reduces the impact of how they hit the water because when they're dropped, their size kind of encourages this fluttering down effect, so they don't hit the water quite as hard actually. Surprisingly, 90% or so of the fish stocked using this method survive. And it's been deemed safer and more efficient of a solution to stock lakes than carrying them up by other means, like say mules carrying water packs, or maybe some of the other ideas that you thought of on that break. So this is a map of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, so just the Sierra Nevada. And this is the black area that was historically fishless. So a majority of large lakes in the Sierra Nevada are regularly stocked by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And it may And not all the fish are supported naturally in the system as like naturally reproducing fish populations. So they're stocked, but they might not be self-sustaining. So they might die off or get caught by anglers, and they'll need to be restocked every 1 to 3 years typically. Now, over 60% of this historically fishless habitat has introduced fish species now, and we'll get into the management challenges of that in the next couple slides. But I did mention we had some native fish species in the Sierra Nevada as well. Fish like the kokanee salmon, mountain whitefish, golden trout in the southeastern creeks, Mackinac Lake trout, to name a few. Mackinac Lake trout is actually a freshwater char, but still. And primarily these fish would be native in the white region more so than in these areas that are higher. So they're native in the lower elevation regions of the mountain range. But that low elevation, high elevation difference exists basically because when the mountains rose so rapidly, there wasn't time for the fish to get into these higher alpine lakes naturally through connected streams and so forth. And so there's just no fish in the top and more fish at the bottom until they were stocked. CDFW hatcheries now raise over 30 million trout annually. So it may come across as a little ironic that the agencies fighting against native species would be deliberately introducing non-native fish into the environment. But anglers are actually providing a lot of capital that are then used by management agencies through license fees and other purchases to help with other management efforts. So in 2020, California had 2.2 million recreational anglers, and those anglers contributed over 79 million to California's economy. And so that's a major contributor to outdoor tourism. And we do want people to get out and enjoy nature. It's been shown that people's disconnect from nature, especially as children, has been shown to decrease the likelihood that that person will want to support conservation efforts with their time, money, and vote later on in life. So we do want that. We want them to be connected with nature. And so this process of putting the trout in and people taking them out, it's called a put and take fishery. So the fish are put in the water, anglers will fish for them recreationally and then catch them and eat them for dinner. Although some anglers prefer the catch and release, where they'll catch them and return them to the creek unharmed and try again. These put and take fisheries in the Western USA and California began in the early 1800s. And at the time, there was no consideration for the ecological ramifications of what that was doing to the system. By about the 1960s, there began a new awareness that this might not be good for the environment, and research was starting to show that fish stocking had negative impacts on the biota and the ecosystem as a whole. But anglers are observant, and they saw evidence of this long before it became an issue that people were really talking about. But it's just that finally somebody started to do something about it. So stocking in the mountain lakes does continue, but the new view is that we need to be mindful of the ecological complexity of the system and how and where this stocking occurs. So nowadays, many fly fisher groups are actually, they have a conservation unit and they discuss local conservation issues at their monthly meeting. And they support annually fisheries research through small grants that they give to different researchers. So one example is the Fly Fishers of Davis group do this. So if you're an avid fly fisher, look them up. They're a great group. But to sum up, if you want to be able to fish, you need a healthy and stable ecosystem to be able to do it in. And many people understand this. Because otherwise, if you don't, the system crashes, the fish aren't there, people are sad, and there's a significant dip of revenue to the California economy as well, which is not good. So it's complicated, and the states continue to try to balance our social values with conservation and financial priorities. These put and take fisheries, though, have introduced a real problem to native Sierra fish populations. So we're finding a dramatic decline in fish populations. We're seeing that happen through a few outlets. So you might have the native and non-native fish hybridizing together. You might have non-native fish experiencing or exerting competition with native fish species there. Introduction of lethal pathogens from those guest species. You would have habitat degradation and fragmentation, whether human caused or just by the repercussions of whatever the new species does to the system. And it also changes fish distribution. So non-native species do have a tendency to thrive in their new habitat, and they push out the native species to go somewhere else and try to find some other habitat to live in. Difficult to do if you're a fish. But fish introductions also have an impact on the ecology within and around the alpine lakes as well. So for example, when a fish eats all the bugs, you suddenly see someone else's food source also wink out in what was historically a fishless lake. So lakes with introduced trout tend to experience a change in the types of aquatic insects that live there, and a decrease in species diversity, mean abundance, and mean size. But now let me pose another question. If the fish does eat all the insects, who do you think it impacts? Who else must have relied on those insects as a food source that now finds themselves needing to look for something else? Well, amphibians, like frogs and salamanders, love to eat insects. Spiders love to eat insects, and also birds. So an aquatic insect's life cycle begins in the water, and then after it grows big enough, it pupates just like a caterpillar would, and it becomes a terrestrial flying insect. So picture this. Have you ever seen a dragonfly as a baby dragonfly? Most people realize they can't picture it, which is one of my favorite parts of this talk. A dragonfly that you see on land is actually the adult version of the aquatic insect that emerged from water. So you're only seeing its final life stage at that point. And many aquatic insects have life stages like this. So caddisflies, mayflies, stoneflies, water beetles, dragonflies, they all have life cycles like this. So you can see that in this illustration here. You start out your life as an aquatic egg mass. There's lots of eggs here, and some survive and some don't. And then as you grow up, you turn into a juvenile aquatic insect. Typically, these are numbered by instars. So most of them have 5 instars. So they go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But some have different numbers. They might even have as many as like 10 or something. So it depends on the species. But basically, they grow up to this smaller version of themselves, and then they eventually grow to the largest form that they will be in their aquatic life. Since this is a diagram of a caddisfly, then there's also a picture of a case next to it that it built for itself for protection, which is unique to these insects. And then what the insects do, they'll pupate like a caterpillar would, and turn into a winged insect that comes out of the water and does its thing, flies around, gets eaten by a bird, things like that. So now that, how do introduced fish impact birds more specifically? Well, a study by researchers here at Davis found that introduced trout outcompeted the rosy finch, an alpine nesting bird, because the fish ate so much that the juvenile aquatic mayflies in the lake, they just found that there were 98% fewer mayflies that were emerging as terrestrial winged adults from that system. So the finches had no food, and the trout altered a major aquatic insect subsidy for them. So these are migratory birds that are flying over, and they're counting on this food source to come out of the lake every year as they migrate to feed their young. And then they set up their nest next to a lake, and it turns out it was a fish lake and no food comes out. Then they have to fly much further to find food for their young, and they're exerting a lot more energy to find food to then bring back to their nest. So it causes problems. As for amphibians, there are also 3 species of frogs and 1 toad endemic to the Sierra Nevada. And all of these are endangered species with the exception of the foothill yellow-legged frog, which is currently experiencing rapid population decline. And that's largely due to fish introductions, as well as a chytrid fungus. But as for the fish, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that when you add fish to a prime frog habitat, like a nice fishless lake, then the fish are going to eat all the tadpoles. And hardly any amphibians survive after a lake's been stocked. So this is a 2001 study that by Knapp and Matthews, and they showed that frogs were 6 times more abundant in fishless lakes. And the implications of wiping out the amphibian populations at fish lakes was so dramatic that it had effects at all scales, causing a complete food web cascade. So A food web or trophic cascade can often result in dramatic changes in ecosystem structure. It can be caused by direct predation, indirect top-down effects, and all sorts of things like that. It can change the community composition and mean size too, though. So say if a fish eats um, the larger zooplankton in the lake, because those are the ones that they can see easier, then only a sparse number of the smaller zooplankton are going to be left in that system because they're just harder to see. But when you end up with only a small size class of zooplankton, their mouths are literally not big enough to eat algae that's bigger than their bodies. So you're going to end up with them only able to eat smaller pieces of the algae and phytoplankton, and all of the larger pieces remain, which is actually why then you will see that the lake will be greener, just because you introduced fish that ate larger zooplankton that left small zooplankton unable to eat enough of that algae because they just couldn't do it. So that's an example of a cascade that could happen. And just as we discussed, dramatic decreases in insects and amphibians and nutrient subsidies can dramatically change how the whole food web works. And there's the dragonfly emerging. Now, after all that bad stuff, let's look at what we can do about it. So there are some management options that people have tried. You can remove the non-native fish through rotenone or gill netting techniques. So throwing rotenone in a lake is basically throwing a toxic pesticide in the system, and you're going to kill everything, including the native species as well. So that's not great, but they used to do it. Still do, actually. Gill netting is preferred though, because while it is more expensive and time consuming, it's ultimately better for those sensitive native species than the rotenone. If you check the gill net often enough, you could free the native species, but gill nets are still pretty harsh on those fish. So it's really hard to basically get the fish out. But even with gill netting, you're only able to get fish of a certain size and up. The small fry, the babies that are going to persist in the system anyway, they're not going to be caught by a gill net. And so even if you got all the big fish out, there's still going to be a remaining population in there that you have to come back for. People have also tried breeding more native trout at hatcheries, for example, and then reintroducing them into lakes. They've tried species listings, so by listing it as threatened or endangered, they're hoping to provide some conservation status to the species. They're also trying to restore lost habitat for native fishes, so humans and introduced species have changed the habitat structure that was there previously, and so by trying to remove the non-natives and fix what was there so that it is more like the habitat the native fish experience, then you might be more likely to have it persist when you reintroduce it into the system. And then there are all kinds of organizations that are aiming to protect and restore wild trout throughout the Sierra Nevada and California as well. So in particular, these various management efforts that have been tried to target bringing back, say, the endemic Lahontan cutthroat trout. So that's one specific one that we've been trying to bring back for a while. LCT is a long-lived fish, is idiroparous, and is pretty physiologically tolerant. But there are fewer than 1,000 of these fish in the wild today. They were listed as endangered in 1970 and then reclassified as threatened 5 years later, but their population is still struggling. So LCT is found in cold water habitats, and in the habitat that they are found in here, their chances of survival are poor. So the major threat for them is the physical and biological habitat fragmentation and decreasing migration rates. So for LCT, it's really important to have a network population to encourage self-persistence and self-sustaining populations. And the ongoing restoration and recovery projects have been going on in recent decades, led by government agencies and universities and nonprofits to try to prevent that fragmentation. Overfishing and loss of genetic diversity are also two big ones that have been really hurting this population. The overfishing and habitat degradation that did occur in its native range prior to the 1930s caused LCT to disappear from the Lake Tahoe Basin almost entirely. In 2002, the efforts to restore LCT to Fallen Leaf Lake began. So that's just one lake, and they've been trying for a very long time since then. LCT was also used to be a top predator in Lake Tahoe, though. Lake Tahoe experienced a dramatic food web shift that after the introduction of non-native species. So some were on purpose probably, and some were by accident. So say a boat that was in a different water body brought in a non-native species on it. They didn't clean the boat properly, put the boat in the water at Lake Tahoe, that aquatic species let go, and now is in a new habitat that didn't used to have that critter. So that's especially why at boat ramps and things, especially in the mountains, you'll see signs of really clean your boat, get all the water out, dry it, bleach it if you can. And even for things like your boots, if you're hiking and you go to multiple basins, you're potentially spreading something you don't even see, some small freshwater snail or some sponge or chytrid fungus for the frogs. So be mindful of those signs. But so in Lake Tahoe, it has many invasive species, and researchers believe that this key tipping point for their food web, though, that dramatically altered it, was the introduction of this mysis shrimp, this tiny little thing, and this lake trout. And by introducing those two species, it was the thing that really dramatically shifted that food web from being benthic dominated to pelagic dominated, which means that most of the production and food sources from the lake are happening in the benthic or shallow zone of the lake, as opposed to the open water pelagic zone. And then it shifted from benthic to being primarily pelagic dominated for its food sources. So as long as mysis shrimp are in Tahoe, researchers believe that there will be no LCT in that lake. And given that's why reintroduction efforts have been focused on these neighboring lakes, because the chances of ever removing those tiny little mysis from a lake as big as Tahoe is quite improbable. So hopefully this has given you a sense of how intricate and involved it can be to manage a mountain lake or lake basin. And we're presented with challenges such as which lakes to manage for fisheries, since the practice of stocking fish is probably here to stay to some extent. And how do we do this intelligently? These lakes are facing habitat fragmentation and loss, experiencing non-native species introductions, and while there are species programs to try to remedy this now, they're just not making as much improvement as we'd hope. Or perhaps they're sometimes focusing on single species recovery when a whole ecosystem recovery would be better for that species as well as other ones in the system that are important. Sierra lakes are really sensitive to lake stressors, and it can be really difficult to repair a system like this after it's been so dramatically altered. So small changes here can result in pronounced environmental effects. So our biggest challenge then is how to cohesively manage all the lakes at a landscape scale in a mountain range, for example. Currently, we have a few tools to facilitate conservation and management, but we know they're sensitive to climate change and snowmelt dynamics especially. We know that they have a unique ecology, but we're still at ground zero as to being able to provide good tools to facilitate management of some of the problems that we talked about today, which is why we need to focus on improving our understanding at the mesoscale, the mountain range scale. And that's what I'm hoping to contribute to with my research. So I told you earlier that I study mountain lake freshwater science, and I explore differences in mountain lake abundance and size across mountain ranges. I also work in mountain lake food webs to understand their structure and function. So I thought it'd be fun to share a bit about how my research connects to all of this that we've talked about today and sort of expand upon it too. So briefly, I'll start with how I got here. When I was in college, I was on a pre-dental track actually. And I learned about graduate school and ecology as a profession pretty late. I was in, let's say, my last year of college. And so I got involved in hands-on research experiences, as many as I could, to decide if it was the career path that I wanted. And I pretty quickly figured out that I did want to switch. So I canceled my dental admissions exam and signed up for the GRE that summer instead, and took steps to start my career in freshwater science. So I got to work on a range of projects before coming to Davis. I was catching salamanders. Here's a California newt, one of my favorites. And we were measuring the newts and comparing their morphology and diet in streams versus ponds. I was also a plant community ecology intern for a bit. Then I assisted on a project for the Tuolumne Miwok tribe doing stream surveys of aquatic benthic macroinvertebrates to assess stream health. And then I left California to do some independent research in the Rocky Mountains, looking at how nutrient limitation in alpine lakes changes along an elevation gradient. So you can see that in these two pictures here. I set up these nutrient diffusing substrates, so that's these little blue cups. And inside them is agar, just like you'd find in a petri dish in your microbiology lab. But the agar was spiked with different ratios of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then we put a little disc on top and close the lid. And we put these nutrient diffusing substrates into different water bodies and to see at the end of a couple of weeks, and then a chlorophyll analysis was performed. And then we'll find out which nutrient for that system was the limiting nutrient, an important nutrient that the system didn't have enough of, but if it did, it would thrive more. There would be more phytoplankton, say. And so we're trying to see if at different elevations, you can see different nutrient limitations. After this, I studied aquatic insect ecology and dispersal and genetics for my master's at CSU Stanislaus. And I primarily worked in the Sierra Nevada for that. And now I'm here, still working in the Sierra Nevada, but on very different projects. So my field project in Andrew Ripple's lab is looking at how lake food web structure and function changes across a lake size gradient. So as small lakes to big lakes, and how that influences whether fish in the lake primarily are going to be feeding in the benthic or pelagic habitats, so shore or open water, and how that's going to be affecting the whole lake's food web and stability and productivity. So you can have many different kinds of these lakes on this gradient, shallow lakes, deep lakes, or lower elevation, higher elevation lakes. There's a lot of complexity and nuances that goes into kind of what's been driving lake food webs up here. So far with my crew, I visited 26 remote lakes. So that might not sound like a lot, but that has been 3 full summers worth of work right there. We backpacked to something like about 10 lakes per summer, give or take, depends on the sizes of the lakes and what we get to. And we're backpacking something like 60 to 70 pounds per person with a crew of 2 to 3 people. So we're kind of the opposite of minimalist packers here. But that field gear is necessary. We need it for things like taking water quality measurements. So we need a YSI to do temperature and oxygen profiles. We're filtering water up there. We're collecting fish. So we need to take our boat, gill net. We have aquatic insect sampling gear as well as zooplankton sampling gear. And we're trying to see who's in these lakes. So we are taking temperature and oxygen profiles at each lake, and then we go and sample the food web. So collecting anything that's alive, a little bit of everything. So whether it's the aquatic plants, the insects, fish, we collect particulate organic matter. And then we're also getting some finer measurements on the fish as well. So by measuring, trying to get an idea of consumer maturity by looking at how heavy they are, their length ratios, gonadal indices, and looking at their otoliths, their ear stones. And then finally, the stable isotope analysis, which is for the food web work. And basically all of this is I'm trying to get an inventory of the species that are there. So who's actually in these lakes, and then to look at the whole food web and just see who's eating who, and what these patterns in benthic pelagic coupling are, and if there's a threshold, say like at Lake Tahoe, where beyond a certain size or something going on in the lake that might make that lake shift from benthic to pelagic or the other way around. So you can see that pretty well. Here you've got the littoral zone, pelagic zone, different species are hanging out in the different areas of the lake. And that's really all I have for you today. So to go back to our overview though, you learned today that the estimates of global lake abundance is about 117 to 142 million above a certain size threshold. And this matters because the lakes are aiding in energy flow and material processing at all scales. They contribute to the global energy balance, and they're helping researchers accurately estimate carbon flux, increase the accuracy of climate change modeling, and impacting how they're modeling hydrological and biogeochemical processes. We also talked about how the Sierra Nevada came to be, and then which habitats were historically fishless and why fish were introduced, the complicated history behind that and which species and why. as well as the repercussions of introducing sport fish, such as trout, to previously fishless habitats. So including negative impacts to native fish, amphibians, their aquatic resource subsidies, so like aquatic insects, and potentially resulting in a food web cascade, which is not a good thing. And lastly, we took some time to consider the challenges of managing Sierra lakes and spent some time discussing the Lahan cutthroat trout as a case study. So thanks for tuning in today. If you want to follow along with my research, the project actually has a hashtag on social media. That's hashtag Sierra Fishes. But you can also reach me by email, or if you would like to visit my website, just Google me. You can check on what open research opportunities we have in the lab right now. And so the final question to leave with you is want you to reflect on how you might cohesively manage mountain lake ecosystems at both a regional scale, something more local, and then a landscape scale. So the whole Sierra Nevada, or could you extend that to the Cascades? What about the Rocky Mountains? They've got fish too. So yeah, take care.